I've lived in a small high-rise for nearly 10 years now, just a one-room place built in the late 70s. The decor is quite outdated, but the rent has always been reasonable, and my landlord has been accommodating whenever I've had issues. Most of the neighbors have been quiet, aside from the occasional homeless person rummaging through the dumpster at midnight or a TV that's a bit too loud from downstairs. It's usually been easy for me to fall asleep until my new neighbor moved in a couple of weeks ago. At first, I didn't think anything would go wrong with her. She seemed friendly, if a bit reserved, and appeared to be in her mid to late 30s based on our brief chats at the mailboxes or while doing laundry. She was a recovering addict, trying to start fresh after losing a few friends to substance abuse. I felt sympathy for her and always greeted her warmly. For the first few weeks, things were fine, but then the banging started. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I felt more than heard it. The vibration coming through the floor was enough to make me stop and wonder what on earth was happening. I quickly pulled open the bathroom door and stepped into the living room. Almost immediately, it came again. This time I could hear it clearly. Someone was at one of my neighbor's doors, and they weren't just knocking, they were pounding on it. I groaned to myself. Great. Not the police again. We'd just had them over a few weeks ago due to a fight with a rather aggressive homeless person. But then I realized the banging was different. There were no shouts or orders, just relentless pounding. I felt uneasy, glancing at the closed blinds that covered my window overlooking the second-floor walkway. For a moment, I considered pulling a finger through the slats to peek outside, but just as I thought about it, the banging stopped. The outside world was eerily quiet, save for a dog barking somewhere blocks away. I stood there for a moment listening, but nothing else stirred. Finally, I shrugged it off and went back to bed, thinking I'd deal with it in the morning. The next day, I saw my neighbor, Erin, in the laundry room. We exchanged morning greetings, and after some small talk, I decided to ask her about the banging. "Oh goodness, you heard that?" she asked, her expression turning serious. I nodded, and after a brief silence, she explained with an apologetic tone, "I'm so sorry. That was one of my friends. He dropped off my computer at 2 a.m. I left it at his place while I was moving." I mentally questioned how someone could be so inconsiderate, but I didn't want to seem rude. Instead, I smiled and said, "Well, just let your friends know it needs to be quiet here after 10. I'd hate for you to get in trouble." She nodded, giving me a grateful smile before heading out. That was that, or so I thought. I left the laundry room, got in my car, and went to work. The day went by as usual. After picking up a frozen pizza, I came home, indulged in it while binge-watching classic thrillers, and turned off the TV around 11. After washing my dishes and brushing my teeth, I crawled into bed. It took me about half an hour to get comfortable, but eventually, I drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a loud sound that interrupted a pleasant dream. I glanced at my alarm clock, 2:15 a.m. As I lay there, trying to determine if the noise had been part of my dream, it came again. 3 rhythmic bangs followed by a few moments of silence, then 3 more. My mind slowly started to connect the dots, and I groaned in frustration. "You've got to be kidding me." I threw off the covers and stepped into the living room. The walkway lights cast a dim glow through the closed blinds, so I moved toward them. For another 30 seconds, I stood there in the dark, listening to the pounding at the door. Then, just like before, it stopped. Silence fell, and after a few moments, I pulled down one of the blinds and looked outside. I had a clear view of Erin's front door, but the walkway lights revealed nothing. I raised the blinds higher to check the parking lot and the street, but there wasn't a soul in sight. How could they have vanished so quickly? The last bang had come just 15 seconds ago. I briefly considered opening the door and sticking my head out, but dismissed the idea as a yawn escaped my lips. I'd talk to Erin about it tomorrow if I saw her. For now, I needed to get some sleep to avoid being tired at work. The next day, I didn't see Erin, and when I returned home that evening, I heard my neighbor David open his door behind me. "Have you been hearing someone banging on a door for the past 2 nights?" he asked grumpily. I nodded, and he sighed. Well, I hope it doesn't happen again. It's really getting on my nerves. Most of my neighbors are reluctant to complain about anything, either because they don't want to be seen as a nuisance or they're just too worn out from life to take action. It was just another textbook case of that. As I opened my door, I took one last look at Erin's apartment. I briefly considered knocking on her door, but ultimately decided against it. I didn't know her well, and whoever had been coming around at midnight could be someone unsavory. The last thing I wanted was to get involved in something that could turn dangerous. I tried to put it out of my mind as I prepared dinner and played video games. I hoped I wouldn't be woken again that night, but of course, I was. This time, I threw off the covers and went straight to the front door. As I reached for the handle, something stopped me. I couldn't quite explain it, but I had a strange feeling that urged me not to open the door. Just like the previous 2 nights, the banging suddenly ceased. The warning feeling held me back for a moment, but then I gripped the handle and yanked the door open. The cool night air hit me as I blinked against the bright porch light. I turned to glance around the corner, expecting to see whoever had been banging, but to my shock, there was no one there. How is this possible? The banging had just stopped less than 5 seconds ago. Someone couldn't have moved away that quickly. Confused, I closed the door behind me and stepped onto the walkway, still seeing no one. I decided to check Erin's place, but her blinds were drawn and no light was visible. I shook my head. How could she sleep through all that noise? As I stood there, an unsettling feeling washed over me. A shiver ran up my spine, making me gasp audibly as the sensation of being watched crept over me. Whoever, or whatever, was watching felt anything but friendly. Another chill struck me when I realized I'd left my back exposed to the stairs behind me, the perfect spot for someone to sneak up on me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breaths came in short gasps, and every muscle tightened with raw fear. I clenched my fist and whipped around, ready to strike, but there was no one there. The staircase was empty and dark, yet I could have sworn someone had been standing there. Trying to stay as quiet as possible so I wouldn't wake my neighbors, I cautiously descended the stairs. The motion sensor light flickered on, flooding the area with harsh white light. I reached the bottom, looking left and right down the empty street. Parked cars lined the road, dimly lit by the occasional street lamp, and nothing moved in the night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and I could hear the steady hum of a generator from the boatyard by the river. I stood there for a few more moments, scanning my surroundings, then turned and headed back upstairs, shaking my head. "Come on, Owen. What are you doing?" I muttered to myself as I reached my front door. "This is ridiculous. You could have gotten hurt. Just stay out of it." Stepping inside, I locked the door and promised myself not to get up again for the banging. After all, it couldn't go on much longer, right? I tried to let that thought relax me as I climbed back into bed. My mind drifted back to that sensation at the top of the stairs, a feeling I'd never experienced before, one I didn't like. The fear returned briefly, sending a faint shudder down my spine, but I forced it away. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I finally drifted off to sleep. The next day, I went to the store and bought a bottle of melatonin along with some sleep aids. I'd never needed anything like that before, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. After work, I went home, watched a movie to unwind, and tried to go to bed earlier than usual. I chewed a melatonin gummy, brushed my teeth, and hoped the banging wouldn't start again, or that, at the very least, the gummy would put me in a deep enough sleep to ignore it. I even whispered a silent prayer as I climbed into bed, hoping for an undisturbed night. My prayer wasn't answered. Just after 2, the banging woke me again. Frustration and exhaustion urged me to get up and confront whoever it was, but remembering my promise, I forced myself to stay in bed. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, and eventually, I fell asleep again. It didn't stop there. Night after night, the banging returned. I kept trying the melatonin gummies, hoping they just needed time to work, but they did nothing. I started going to work more and more exhausted, my face showing dark circles from the lack of sleep. A few of my coworkers asked if everything was okay, and I brushed it off, claiming it was a project that was stressing me out. As the week dragged on, I decided to try the stronger sleep aids. For the first week, they seemed to help. I fell asleep quickly and stayed asleep, feeling better physically and mentally. My performance at work improved, and I started to forget about the banging. I even recommended the sleep aids to a few neighbors who were also bothered by the noise. Things finally felt like they were getting back to normal, and I was sure this peace would last. But it didn't. I was jolted awake at the same time as before. Groggy from the sleep aid, I lay in the dark, hearing the banging, and let out a muffled groan. Reality crashed back over me. Had my body built a tolerance to the pills, or was it something else? Whatever it was, I found myself waking to the noise night after night, and exhaustion crept back into my life. My work and social life started to suffer, and even my friends and boss noticed. My boss called me into his office one day, and after I explained, he sighed sympathetically. "Look, Travers," he finally said, "if this is causing you that much stress, why don't you move out? Find somewhere else to live." I explained that every other apartment in town cost over $1,200 a month. This was the last affordable place left under $1,000, and it was all I could afford. My boss sighed, nodding, and looked at me with a hint of pity. "I'm sorry you're stuck in a rough spot, Travers, but your performance has dropped significantly, well below our standards. You've been a dedicated employee for years, but if this keeps up, we may have to reconsider your employment here." I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" I managed to say. He nodded, his expression firm. "I know it's a tough situation, Travis, but we have to consider the big picture. This company has to function at a certain standard, and if people can't keep up." I wanted to say more, but I was speechless. I'd worked there for years, practically since I'd moved to town, and I'd never imagined getting fired. Unable to think of anything else to say, I nodded and left his office. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, feeling like my world was spinning out of control, and I couldn't stop it. As I walked back up the stairs to my apartment, I glanced at Erin's place. As always, her blinds were shut tight, with no sign of life. A sharp feeling of bitterness and anger crept up in me, directed at Erin for not calling the police, at my neighbors for ignoring it, and most of all at myself. I slammed the front door harder than usual and decided to order pizza and breadsticks from Domino's, as I had a few days off. I opted to get drunk, grabbing 2 large bottles of margarita from the fridge. After my food arrived, I started downing them while binge-watching a marathon of the Mummy films. The alcohol made me feel a bit better, and by 12:30 a.m., I stumbled to my room and collapsed onto the bed, falling asleep almost immediately. I groggily blinked awake to the world spinning around me, the alcohol still in my system. My temples throbbed, and as I turned over, trying to shake off the drowsiness, I felt the vibrations of my heartbeat coursing through the bed. I glanced at the ceiling, fighting the urge to vomit when a wave of anger washed over me. This situation was going to cost me my job, my apartment, and my sanity, all because that woman wouldn't answer the damn door. My thoughts spiraled, and for the first time in my life, I saw red. Fueled by my frustration, I stumbled to the closet and grabbed an aluminum baseball bat. I headed for the front door, fully aware that confronting someone who might get violent while I was drunk wasn't smart, but I was fed up. I slipped on my flip-flops and moved toward the door as another round of banging echoed through the apartment. Peeking through the blinds, I saw someone standing directly in front of her door, nearly as tall as the door itself. As I watched, they raised their fist to pound on the door again. "Oh, this guy," I muttered, the alcohol-fueled rage igniting within me. I flung the door open so hard that I almost fell over. "You're not getting away this time," I shouted, my words slightly slurred. The figure froze, arm still raised, as if caught in the act. "I've had enough of you banging on that door for weeks. You're disturbing everyone in this complex." I held the bat in one hand and slammed it against the wooden railing to punctuate my outburst. "If you don't get lost now, I'll give you something to really worry about." I waited, hoping for a response, but the figure just stood there, arm poised. My anger flared again when I heard a soft tapping against the glass. I shifted my gaze and noticed Erin standing behind her window, all the blinds pulled wide open. She was frantically waving at me, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. In that moment, my anger evaporated, replaced by confusion. Suddenly, I noticed the figure had moved away from Aaron's door, and I felt a chill run down my spine as two glowing red eyes fixed on me. I gasped, dropping the bat as a wave of terror washed over me. This was not a person. Aaron was still waving frantically, signaling me to get inside, when the walkway lights went out. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for my door. But as I tried to close it, something slammed against it from the outside. I barely managed to stay upright, gripping the doorknob tightly. With all my strength, I pushed the door, feeling a momentary rush of relief as it closed slightly. But then, a dark hand with sharp, glistening nails pushed through the crack and adrenaline shot through me. I yelled, using all my weight to shove the door closed, and felt it slam against that hand. The creature made no sound, but the pressure on the door increased, forcing me to fight against it. Finally, I managed to shut it all the way and lock it. Silence enveloped the apartment, but I remained pressed against the door, struggling to catch my breath. The banging resumed, more violently than before, shaking the door on its hinges. I stumbled back, collapsing onto the floor as fear paralyzed me. I curled into a ball, convinced the door would give way at any moment. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. A heavy silence filled the air, far more terrifying than the noise had been. I lay there, frozen, unsure if it was the fear or the lingering effects of the alcohol that kept me motionless. Eventually, I lost consciousness. When I finally awoke, sunlight streamed through the blinds, and birds chirped outside. Uncurling myself, I slowly stood and approached the window. With trembling fingers, I opened the blinds, squinting against the brightness. As my eyes adjusted, I looked outside, and everything appeared normal. Perhaps the horrifying night had just been a drunken nightmare after all. I had a terrible dream, and for a moment, I convinced myself it was just a nightmare. But then I glanced at the door and saw deep marks in the metal, reminding me that it was real. A sudden, frantic urge to escape my apartment overwhelmed me. I rushed to my room, grabbed a shirt and jeans, and hastily dressed. I snatched my car keys and flung open the door, letting sunlight flood in. On the entry mat lay a sealed envelope with just my name on it. My heart raced as I surveyed my surroundings. Everything seemed normal. The blinds were tightly shut, and the door was securely locked. Taking a shaky breath, I picked up the envelope, closed the door behind me, and half walked, half ran down the stairs to my car. After locking the doors, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a shaky scrawl that haunted me since I read it in the parking lot nearly 30 days ago. I drove off, hoping the words were wrong. I headed to a nearby county, deciding to spend the night at a motel, praying that the letter was false. But when the thumping started at exactly 2 a.m., I knew Aaron's words were true. "Owen, I'm sorry for this. I didn't want to involve anyone else. I had moved here thinking my neighbors would mind their own business, believing it would be safe. A few months back, I had broken up with my ex, who had fueled my addiction. I thought I was free until she called, claiming she had cursed me, sending a demon to torment me in revenge for leaving her. At first, I dismissed her threats, but then the thumping began. 3 loud knocks at 2 a.m. for 10 minutes. It sounded like the door would burst open, but it never did. When I peeked through the peephole, I saw it. Those red eyes, the wicked grin, the claws. I realized she was telling the truth. I had moved to this complex because, after some research, I learned that the demon she cursed me with would knock on my door for the rest of my life. It couldn't enter by force, but would drive me mad with its persistent thumping, taking pleasure in my suffering. Its goal was to break me down until I opened the door willingly. There was only one way to lift the curse. Someone innocent had to witness the demon and take the curse on themselves. I could never do that. I couldn't bear to see someone else endure such a fate, even to save myself. But that choice was taken from me. It latched onto you, and now the curse is past. It will follow you no matter where you go, continuing its relentless knocking. I'm free now, but at a cost I never wanted to pay. I'm sorry, I can't stick around much longer. I can't bear to see it happen to you. Please forgive me. The next day, I returned to my apartment, realizing running was pointless. It would follow me. Erin moved out the day after I got back. I watched her pack up and drive away, unable to say a word as the thumping resumed at my door. Every day, I feel more exhausted, more unstable. I barely managed to keep my job, but eventually, my boss called me into his office and fired me. My savings are dwindling, and I don't know what will happen when they run out. That's not even the worst part. Erin's letter still echoes in my mind, haunting me with thoughts of passing the curse along. I wouldn't wish this fate on my worst enemy, and I don't want to hurt anyone. But I'm growing weaker, and I don't know how much longer I can endure this. How long until I break? How long until I lead someone else to see it?